We recorded this episode last night, and while editing it this morning, I looked online and saw that our former Premier, Christy Clark, had resigned as leader of the BC Liberals and will be resigning her seat as well on August 4th. We don't discuss this breaking news in this episode, obviously, but we'll hopefully have some content for you either later this weekend or next week discussing our takes on that. But for now, enjoy the show. Coming to you from the West Coast, this is Politicos. We're recording this on July 27th, 2017, and this is episode 45. Politicos is a podcast that explores what's happening in British Columbia and across the country. If you haven't already, make sure to subscribe and leave a review on Apple Podcasts. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, where we're at PoliticosPod, and support the show at patreon.com/politicos.
I'm Scott.
And I'm Ian. On this week's show, we discuss a roundup of the first 10 days of the Horgan government. We have an interview with NDP leadership candidate Niki Ashton, and we end with some quick takes on Vancouver, Alberta, and US political stories, just sort of a tour of the globe of North America, as it were. But first, we need to give a special shout out to our latest, ministerial patron, I think is what we classified it as, Stephen Tweedale. Stephen tweeted that he dreamt about the importance of Canadian political podcasts, which inspired him to pledge the show. In other words, he's sort of our exact target demographic type of listener, that kind of level of nerd. But for anyone else who's out there listening, if you want to hear any of our past full interviews, including the one with Niki Ashton or last week's Tom Davidoff, or I highly recommend the one with Stephen Carter from a few weeks ago, former strategist, where he criticizes us for having him on the night of the BC confidence vote, go to patreon.com/politicos. Payments are processed on the 1st, so if you get up there in the next couple of days, you can be in our sort of August supporters, which would be fantastic, and hopefully we can reach our next goal. But first up, governing is harder than it looks. This week we got the mandate letters for each of the new ministers. I guess this is just what governments do now. They just tell us what they're telling the ministers to do.
Yeah, so this is all up on the BC government website, but there's a few interesting parts in the various mandate letters. Most of it is basically what we got from both the party platforms and the Green NDP supply and confidence agreement, but there's a few interesting little bits in there, such as for transportation infrastructure, mandate letter calls for end in tolls, yet supporting the mayor's 10-year plan for the Metro Vancouver area's transportation, which is notable because it calls for road pricing, aka tolls. So I'm more than a little confused on how the NDP manages to do both.
Maybe they'll take tolls off the two bridges that they said they would and just put a sort of downtown Vancouver congestion, or investigate doing that and maybe down the road look at it. It is a clear tension, and I think that's inevitable, especially on such a razor-thin government. I think we both are fairly supportive of the idea of road pricing because we happen to live in the city of Vancouver and traffic is always hell. So anything that can reduce that and promote and fund transit infrastructure, I think we're both widely supportive of. But the toll commitment was a strong one for the NDP, and given the votes they won in Surrey and suburban Metro Vancouver, arguably on the back of this promise, that's going to be a priority. And I think as soon as we see the budget come down in the fall, we're going to see tolls get pulled in that first budget.
The only other notable bits on the transportation file is there's going to be an acceleration on the upgrades to the highway to Alberta. So we're actually going to get those 4 lanes all the way to the Alberta border a little bit faster, but it's not really clear on when. And they're also going along with plans to go back to the seniors' weekday discounts on the ferries. I know past guests, and whose interview you can check out on Patreon as well, Lindsay Tedds criticized them for in the campaign.
In George Hayman's mandate as environment minister, he's got the sort of obvious things of renewing the climate leadership team, increasing the carbon tax together with the finance minister, doing some environmental assessments, but he's got the tough job of employing every tool available to stop the expansion of Kinder Morgan. And we'll come back to that when we sort of discuss some of the other news that's come up this week. But that's going to be a big task. Meanwhile, over in energy, Michelle Mungle has a lot of the other big files to take on. such as freezing BC Hydro rates, conducting a review of BC Hydro at the same time, invigorating the Innovative Clean Energy Fund, referring Site C Dam to the BC Utilities Commission, and creating a BC Mining Jobs Task Force, which I guess will create and sustain good jobs in such an important industry. And there's nothing like a good government task force to sort of push some responsibility away and say you're doing something well. And it's not like the NDP are going to be any worse at this than the Liberals. Both create lots of task force. And
yeah, but unless that task force can raise commodity prices, they're probably not doing a huge amount one way or the other for the mining jobs.
The other thing in the energy mandate that's potentially going to raise some hairs on the back of the Green Party's necks is this tension that she's responsible for making sure liquid LNG sort of goes forward in a way that's beneficial for British Columbians. Now, the Green Party wants no LNG. The BC NDP approach to LNG is going to sort of require a 4-pronged test. I guess we don't use 5 conditions anymore. We only use 4 because we're a new government. These 4 include express guarantees that the proposals will bring jobs and training opportunities to British Columbians. That seems pretty easy for most to meet. That proposals must provide a fair return on our resources.
A little ambiguous.
But flexibility is sometimes nice, I guess. Make sure proposals respect and make partners of First Nations. I think that's an inevitable requirement in the current climate. And make sure proposals protect our air, land, and water, including living up to our climate commitments. And that's enough flexibility to sort of say, well, this one's okay, but this one we don't like. It gives you bars that are pretty political in nature, by it seems. And so the Greens would argue no LNG projects meet that 4th test, whereas the NDP might say, well, this one's very important because jobs.
Yeah, or, they might go with well, this is going to displace some dirtier source of fuel, so, yeah, marginal gain. I guess if it's worth the jobs, we can go ahead with it.
But the person who's probably going to be the busiest out of all the ministers, at least in my view, is David Eby as Attorney General. In addition to the standard sort of reform the justice system and legal aid, which they've committed to, especially since it's been woefully underfunded in recent years, he's got this massive list of sort of headline promises, like reforming campaign finance rules, bringing forward the bill to have a referendum on proportional representation, like reestablishing a human rights commission and bringing in some lobbying reform as well. He's also in charge of a comprehensive review of ICBC. So I think David Eby is going to be potentially busier than if he had won the lead or had sought and won the leadership a few years ago.
Yeah, his plate's going to be pretty full for the next 4 years. And there's a few files in there that are definitely going to be tricky. Electoral reform is one of these notoriously difficult things to actually get passed if they are even interested in really going to bat for it. As well as ICBC has some rather serious financial challenges that we'll be getting into in a few minutes, but will definitely make life hard for David Eby trying to figure that all out.
Well, and one of the things that's already come up is he's started hinting that maybe campaign finance reform won't be rushed through as the first bill because they want to consult and get it right. And it sounds like he's sort of floating that trial balloon out there that's making everyone go, no, you need to do this now because Wild West BC, and why did people not vote for the Liberals in the last election is because this issue among nothing else.
Yeah, they've introduced 6 bills before now to do this reform. The Greens had it as basically their top priority in the agreement. Like, there's really no reason they, A, shouldn't have thought about this in detail, and B, not be ready to go right away.
The strategist and cynic sort of view on it is that the NDP is still sitting on a big debt from the previous election, and so they need a bit more time to sort of refuel and refill their coffers, particularly if we head back to a snap election, because things fall apart like everyone is still kind of predicting they will. But a little bit less.
Yeah, or if the Greens get angry because they aren't getting their campaign finance reform.
So they're in this we need more money, but we also need to ban getting more money, so it's how fast can they get it in. There are also the sort of calls to make a bill retroactive to the election, which is a nice idea, but in principle it gets a bit messy considering the two major parties have already collected a bunch of major donations.
And spent some of that money probably too. And especially in the case of the NDP, if they have a deficit where, they've now probably paid off part of that and would have to then go back into debt outside an election period to pay back campaign contributions during an election.
So campaign finance has already been a headache on David Eby's plate. On the ICBC side, a report from Ernst & Young was leaked this week that was commissioned by the previous government to look at the state of ICBC. And it wasn't a positive report. It wasn't very optimistic. It suggested that by 2019, just 2 years from now, insurers could be paying $2,000 a year instead of the $1,200 or $1,300 they're paying right now. Basically, there'd have to be 30% rate hikes if nothing else changes. And when you're a new government, finding out that everyone's life is going to get 30% more expensive, because just about everyone owns a car in this province, I can't imagine how much he's sweating right now. So immediately, David Eby dismissed some of the main proposals to deal with this, which was the massive rate hike, putting photo radar back out on the streets to ding people and just sort of pay for insurance by speeders, and the idea of no-fault insurance, which some jurisdictions have used to basically just get the payouts under control. And it's one of those kind of counterintuitive ideas that I think I kind of like, but I haven't looked at enough. I like weird policies, and no-fault insurance seems like a fun one that maybe it's a terrible system and maybe it screws over everyone. But with those three major tools off the table, it's going to be difficult to find the revenue to fix the problems.
Yeah, and BC already has one of the highest insurance rates in the country, so it's not even like they can point to other provinces and be like, oh, we're only catching up to these guys over here.
I was trying to look at this on Twitter earlier in the week, and I know I found a couple comparisons that were, a couple years old, but I think still valid. The Maritimes are pretty cheap, and I think the argument there is they're really small provinces, so there's not a lot of highway to get in accidents in. At least that's in my mind.
Plus, the drivers are really nice and unaggressive there, so I don't think you get a lot of reckless driving the way you sometimes see around here.
And then you also have Quebec, which has very big highways, but they subsidize everything, so let's put them in a other corner. And then you have sort of Ontario West, where Ontario has the highest rates, or BC, depending on the year, and Alberta and Saskatchewan aren't too far behind. So it's not like we're paying 20% more, 30% more than anywhere. But it's, $100, $150 a year more, which can add up. It's still, in my mind, the easiest function of insurance rates is the length of your highways. So I don't know what the solution is. It's going to be a tough file to deal with for sure.
The other news from David Eby this week is him coming out and saying the BC government isn't actually going to be delaying the permits for Kinder Morgan. And that was one of the theories people had on how they're going to fight it, is because it's a federally regulated project, so they can't actually just flat out say no to it. But the idea was they dragged out all the permits and basically make it a huge pain in the ass to actually get any of the stuff built that's required. And David Eby basically said, this would be a very good way for us to get sued, so we're not going to do it.
Considering the NDP has spent months talking about we will do everything we can to stop this project, even if it's valid and legitimate to go through, to then turn around and take sort of questionably legal, if there's any question around the actions they take, they will get sued and potentially have an easy loss, since Kinder Morgan will be able to just sort of go through the public record and say, here's where you said you would just bend the rules to stop us, and you clearly just bent the rules. So on the one hand, the smart decision, but it's kind of also the only decision they can do if they don't want to just be seen pissing away the public's money in court, which is never a great look. I mean, some environmentalists would be happy, but if it's ultimately going to lose, might be better to focus those energies on other tactics.
Yeah, and it's not exactly unheard of for a government to spend a whole bunch of taxpayer money fighting a losing court case because it's the politically palatable option.
At the federal level, it's what the Conservatives want us to do with Omar Khadr, but...
And they're still talking about that for some reason. But yeah, this is one of those smart moves on the new government's part, and while it may not play particularly well with the base, or the Greens for that matter, it's one of those signs they're starting to deal with the pragmatic concerns of governing and making compromises where necessary.
Well, and relatedly on the energy front, the other sort of big news the NDP have had to deal with this week is Petronas has decided to not go ahead with its Pacific Northwest LNG project in Port Edward. I think we actually covered this on our first or maybe second episode. I don't know if it's worth going back to listen because some of those first episodes could be a bit dicey in terms of how much we knew about podcasting, but if you want, you can go back to those. They're all on our website. Petronas's main argument for canceling this project was the low natural gas prices. And I think even at the time, people were talking about this project might not go ahead because it's very expensive and natural gas isn't worth enough to make it worth building a giant mega project. And so it was, I think, teetering on the edge. And so their argument still follows that.
Yeah, this sort of project really hasn't been economical since around 2014 when energy prices dropped significantly. And this is more them just taking the project off life support.
Of course, the liberal hacks on Twitter and everywhere else are saying, oh, look, NDP comes in, energy project gets shelved. Clearly, it's causation. And this goes right up to Mike Smith in the province, who said, yeah, of course Petronas is going to say it's gas prices because they don't want to piss off the government if they have to try and get other projects through. But it's got to be something related to how much the NDP is anti-energy projects, anti-jobs, and that's why they killed it in the end.
The timing on this definitely isn't good for the NDP, and coming right on the heels of them taking power, it does at least give the impression that there might be a political reason as much as an economic reason for it.
Ultimately, it probably gives some fuel to the NDP's environmental side, lets them feel a bit more emboldened, like even if it's not connected, if the NDP ultimately can't stop Kinder Morgan, they can at least kind of point to projects that they didn't intentionally kill and probably realistically weren't even responsible for, but they can go, look, that's not going. LNG was never really going to go through in BC because the prices are just too low and the Liberals promised it and failed to deliver. So the timing is, I guess, unfortunate on the one hand. Maybe the NDP can take something from it. All right, well, moving on. On Tuesday, I sat down with NDP leadership candidate Niki Ashton, so let's roll that clip. All right, so I'm sitting down today with Niki Ashton, candidate for the leadership of Canada's NDP. Thank you for joining me today, Niki.
Great to be with you.
Scott couldn't be here today, but he's given me some questions to maybe push back on you a little bit, and I have a bunch of my own to ask as well. But let's just sort of start off with a bit of your background and why you got into politics and why you put your name forward again for leader of the NDP.
Sure. Well, first off, I would say that the reason why I'm running is because I do believe that our party is at a crossroads. It's clear to me that in the last election and leading up to the last election as well, we distanced ourselves from some key principles and I think also a sense of being a movement. And we allowed the Liberals to outleft us. And that's something that, gave the Liberals a leg up. Now, of course, they've gone on to break a number of their progressive promises to Canadians. But I think it's important for us to reconnect with our roots, reconnect with the people that share our values and rebuild the NDP. I also believe that Canada's at a crossroads, and the big issues of our time are growing inequality and the threat of climate change. And for me, and I know for many out there as well that I've had the opportunity to speak to, it's clear that we are at this point, both in terms of inequality and climate change, because of political and economic decisions that have brought us here, and particularly the neoliberal agenda, and privatization, deregulation, austerity, bad trade deals, and the list goes on. And I believe that what we need is a strong progressive vision, a vision on the left, rooted in the left, to reject the status quo and put forward, a true sort of a bold, visionary agenda to take on inequality and climate change. And for me, this is, I've subscribed to this view for a long time. I come from a part of the country, northern Manitoba, where we produce immense wealth in the country, and yet so many of the people that live there have struggle in different ways and struggle in very big ways. Whether it's the abject poverty that many First Nations face in our region, whether it's the struggles of working people that work underground and work in forestry and day in and day out work hard and continue to struggle. There's a real sense that our region, like many parts of the country, are on the margins. And so when I first got involved in politics, it was very important for me to be a voice for our region, my home, but to be a voice for folks that are on the margins, that are ignored by power, that are frankly exploited by power. I will say that I didn't see myself getting involved in electoral politics. I mean, I was political and supported the NDP. I grew up in an NDP household, but really, what led me directly to running was in 2005. The issue of our time at that time was same-sex marriage. My member of parliament, an NDPer, was against gay marriage, which of course is party policy. And many of us were horrified. And we organized first to try and get her to change her mind. That did not happen. And then we organized, thankfully in the context of a Democratic Party, to challenge her in the nomination. And for me, LGBTQ rights are human rights. Human rights are non-negotiable. I'm proud that the NDP has always been a strong party on these issues. And, back at that time, I stood up for the issue. I stood up to the establishment. There were many people that said, "Don't rock the boat," and many of us at home said, "No, we will rock the boat because we believe that the time to stand up for human rights is now, and the time to stand up for our region." And saying that, yes, we stand for human rights is now as well. And there were a lot of people that said, well, I remember hearing this in Ottawa, you guys are blue collar, and folks in northern parts of the country aren't usually okay with these kinds of things being human rights. And many of us, rejected obviously that notion and said, we're going to fight back. So that was my entry directly into politics, but definitely a sense of being a voice and fighting alongside those that are fighting for justice from day one.
So you did run in the 2011 leadership race to replace Jack Layton after he died so too early, frankly. But you didn't win, and you did come in last. So what do you think you learned from that lesson and that race, and why do you think this time things will go better for you? Because I'm assuming you're planning to win.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very different race, and and last time when we ran, I was really proud of the campaign we put forward, and we actually talked about very similar themes in terms of growing inequality, in terms of climate change. I talked about this idea of new politics, which engaging with social movements and activists. So I mean, I'm the same person, but I will say one thing that's changed is Canada has changed. Inequality has become worse. The 1% is wealthier, the middle class is disappearing, folks on the margins are being squeezed further and further, and obviously, no secret, climate change is getting worse and worse as well. And so and I'll also, and added to that when we're talking about the position of the party, in 2011 we were official opposition. It was a difficult time with Jack's loss, but he left us in a great place, and now we've lost ground. And we've lost ground, I think, in a way where, where we need to regroup and really grapple with the fact that the issues that we're facing as a country require an unabashedly proud NDP agenda. And so that's I'm really excited to be able to talk about that in this race. I've talked many times about how I've been deeply inspired by Bernie Sanders' campaign, by Jeremy Corbyn's campaign, and I was inspired because they spoke to the issues that we're facing here in Canada too. And I think that's why we need to bring that kind of political vision to our country to be able to take on the big challenges of our time. Obviously, we're running to win, and it is a very exciting race for sure. I mean, just a few weeks ago, the Main Street poll that came out indicated that we were a close second. But we're obviously not taking anything for granted. I mean, this is a very dynamic race. It's one member, one vote. So we're certainly encouraging folks that, with whom our messages are resonating and that, may have left the party because they were disenchanted or disillusioned, people that never looked to a party to get involved but share our values for justice. And we're seeing that people are reconnecting, are signing up. A lot of young people signing up for the first time and getting engaged. And so I'm very excited by that kind of momentum we're seeing out there. And it's clear to me that it's deeply connected with the kind of principled progressive vision we're putting forward.
Well, let's get into that vision then. Let's maybe talk a few specifics. What's the plank that you've released that you're most proud of, and take me through it.
Well, I'm proud of all of them. I don't think I can single anyone out, but I'm proud of the fact that right at the get-go of the campaign, we talked about this is a campaign in pursuit of building a movement to achieve social, environmental, and economic justice, and early on we put out a platform out on economic justice, and that's had a few different segments that we've put out over time, including our tax reform policy, and I'll go back to that in a second. Our environmental justice policy we just put out recently. I'm very proud of the work we've done on that front. And in terms of social justice, we've put out parts of it already, including the gender-based or gender justice platform, and there's more to come as well. And one of the things we've said is the importance of having platforms that are rooted in core principles. And so, a core principle for us has been the grassroots, and like I said, tackling inequality. So whether we're talking about economic justice or environmental justice, what we're saying is that the solutions lie in putting people ahead of profits, in ensuring, for example, in the case of economic justice, that it's grassroots through our advisory boards, that through citizen power, including through a public Crown Corporation, that we are coming up with solutions and we're tackling climate change that makes sense. And so I would say, we've put forward some very bold ideas around free tuition, around pharmacare, around dental care, around mental health, for example. And, a lot of times people say, well, how can you pay for these things? And that's why I am really proud that our tax reform policy does lay out very clearly how we would, to the tune of about $40 billion, in fact. And what we're saying is, yes, tax reform means making the rich pay their fair share, making corporations pay their fair share. And that's something that I think is, it's high time we push for. In fact, a generation ago, the wealthiest Canadians paid more than they pay today. And so it's no secret that we've cut back. We can pay for less. And I would say it also makes sense why so many working middle and low income Canadians are very frustrated that they're not able to get by, or it's increasingly difficult for them to get by, while the 1% continues to get wealthier. And so we've laid out very clearly, yes, we would invest in the following priorities, but this is how we would find the resources to be able to invest in these priorities too.
Laying out such a ambitious sort of tax the wealthy plan, how do you respond to those who would say that the world's sort of done a race to the bottom on taxes? One jurisdiction lowers, so another lowers to be competitive. Whereas if we sort of made this big jump in taxes, how would we stop wealth from fleeing Canada and it crippling our economy?
Yeah, I mean, I find that argument I mean, it sort of engages in fear mongering, and I think we're sort of in many ways. I mean, there were people that will say that, certainly in the mainstream media as well, but the reality is that we've been allowing the wealthiest of Canadians and corporations to accrue significant wealth and significant profits at the expense of Canadians overall. I mean, I will say on the corporate tax rate, I mean, the U.S. has a higher corporate tax rate than Canada. And have we seen much come from the much lower tax rate that we've had? We've seen, capital flight, corporations leaving Canada, very much tied to trade deals that benefit them at the expense of Canadian workers. We've seen foreign ownership do away with much of the kind of sovereignty that we or self-determination, I guess we used to have around the use of our resources, and I think it's dropping our corporate tax rate to 15% under Harper, which continues under Trudeau, certainly hasn't brought the kind of wealth creation and wealth distribution that one would hope. In fact, as has been indicated, Canadians are worse and worse off, right? I mean, and identify as being worse off. 10 years ago, 67% of Canadians identified as middle class. That number is down to 47%. So instead of getting better, we're becoming worse. And I see this through my work, whether it's at home or across the country, and as part of our work in Parliament, Canadians are very frustrated, right? I mean, Canadian taxpayers pay, middle class, working class taxpayers pay their fair share of taxes. And who isn't? It's the rich, and they get away with it legally or otherwise. And I see a lot of people that are frustrated, that want change, that are demanding that we close the tax loopholes, that we up the kind of reform taxes in such a way that the rich are paying their fair share. And so it's clear to me that there is an appetite to do things differently, and I would say that we can't afford not to, because we will only become more unequal, and we will we'll starve the social safety net, the kind of social programs, and frankly prevent ourselves from making the kinds of investments we need to be making to build a better future.
On trade deals, what are it's a common sort of whipping boy these days of Donald Trump, but also Bernie Sanders. And even if they identify necessarily the same problem, or we can agree on the problem, they offer vastly different prescriptions on how to solve it. And you'd obviously side more with the Sanders type solutions. In the world, we obviously can't exist without interacting with other countries. BC here, we need to sell our softwood to the US, and resource economies depend on that sort of international trade. So how do we structure deals better, and what are the sort of things that have gone wrong in your view?
Well, I mean, it's clear to me that trade deals in recent years have certainly prioritized corporate interests at the expense of working people. I mean, I've had the opportunity through my work as a member of Parliament, and obviously even now during the leadership, to spend time in parts of the country that make a very clear connection between NAFTA and the hollowing out of their economy. So I visited in Southwest Ontario and seen swaths of cities that are full of abandoned factories. I'll never forget in Windsor when we were doing our tour on precarious work in the millennial generation last year, where you heard about how this is a whole part of the country where precarious work for any generation is the norm. Temp agencies, contract work, temporary work, no benefits, no pension. And we heard heartbreaking stories. Our meeting there was people of different generations that talked about how difficult the situation has become in Windsor because of NAFTA, and because of the kinds of job-killing trade deals that we're committed to. And there was a young woman that spoke towards the end of that meeting, and I'll never forget. And she said, that she had come back to Windsor to get a third degree. She moved back into her parents' basement. to try and get this third degree so that she could finally find work. But she wasn't sure she would. She said, "I hope I will find work as a result of this third degree. But one thing I know I won't be able to do is have kids, because I could never give them what my parents gave me." I mean, for me, this is the human side. I mean, certainly generationally, but also regionally, of what trade deals have done to our country. We've certainly, we've let people down. And I would say, when you have Brian Mulroney, the architect of NAFTA, advising Justin Trudeau on how to deal with Donald Trump, I'm certainly not holding my breath that Canadian workers are going to be front and center, the focus of the federal government's agenda. I absolutely, I mean, trade is key, but I believe we need to be pushing for fair trade, not the kind of free trade that's being, the free trade mantra that's been thrown out there. We know CETA will lead to the loss of tens of thousands of good jobs. In fact, I believe it was in the manufacturing sector, it would be over 40,000 jobs in Canada could be lost as a result of CETA, never mind the impacts on the dairy industry and pharmaceutical industry. Obviously the trade discussions with China are very troubling, where it's clear that China has the extreme upper hand and Canada's not pushing for much from our side. I'm concerned that we have a prime minister that isn't standing up for Canadian workers, but has indicated time and time again that he's willing to stand up for corporate interests. And so I think what's necessary, and certainly, I mean, the NDP's been doing some very good work on this, but if I were to be elected leader, I'd be proud to oppose bad trade deals and would certainly, at every opportunity, stand up for Canadian workers.
One of the things you mentioned in your sort of economics policy alongside there is creating this sort of national good jobs, stable jobs program. Could you go into a little bit more detail about how that would work at the national level?
Yeah, I mean, we've put it forward as sort of a visionary piece, recognizing that the federal government has a role to play in terms of job creation. I mentioned earlier that I've been involved in the discussion around the rise of precarious work, which is particularly troubling amongst young people. A growing number of young people are stuck in a cycle of precarious work. In fact, the latest job numbers indicate that there's been a serious improvement in terms of jobs for people above the age of 50, but if you're under the age of 30, and millennials are slightly older than that, so if you're in that sort of demographic, the job market is not actually improving. And so yes, there may be some more part-time jobs available, but stable jobs are not there. The federal government is involved in job creation already in terms of, we have Canada Summer Jobs through Employment Service Development Canada. It's involved in some targeted initiatives. What we're saying is that this could be expanded, not just, with a focus on young people. Obviously, it's critical given what young people are facing in our country, but it could be expanded further. In terms of direct job creation, in terms of partnership, but we've also been very clear that good jobs also come from things like public ownership. And so our campaigns propose public ownership in three key sectors: the banking sector through postal banking, the health sector through the creation of a crown corporation that would be involved in purchasing and distribution of pharmaceuticals, and also through in the energy sector, and particularly focusing on green energy and the creation of a crown corp that would direct federal investment towards transition to a carbon-free economy. These are ways of creating jobs in our communities and in our country, and that could be part of the direct sort of the federal action that could make a difference for Canadians in terms of jobs.
Let's pivot back to something you mentioned in your opening remarks. You mentioned the phrase neoliberal agenda, and you've gotten some flack from that in the mainstream media and elsewhere,
yes,
especially among economists who see the phrase as maybe sort of vague and without a hard definition. Perhaps you could just clarify what you mean by it when you're using it, so that it clears up that definition maybe. And then perhaps we can go on to a controversy where you mentioned it in relation to its role for climate change. And what Scott really wants to know is, if neoliberalism is a problem for climate change, well then what about the sort of anti-neoliberal countries, the Soviet Union or Maoist China, in his words, who also haven't seemed to have done, at least historically, much in terms of contributing to the solution. Question.
Sure. So, I mean, when I talk about neoliberalism, I certainly, I mean, it's clear to me that not everybody agrees with the concept. So, I mean, I think, I mean, it's a loaded concept. But I think if we're going to be straight up about what we're facing today, it in the last 3 decades, it has been a neoliberal approach. I mean, the Reagan, Thatcher era, Mulroney era set us down a path where it was sort of small government, austerity, privatization, deregulation, outsourcing, free market trade deals. Basically, the market always the market reigns, and government is a burden, and we go forward. And so I do, I appreciate that some may disagree with it, but that doesn't mean that that's not actually what's happened. I mean, I will say that I think it is important to call out what we're experiencing as the impacts of a neoliberal agenda, because to just sort of sit back in wonderment as to how the rich have become richer and everybody else has become squeezed, is becoming more and more squeezed, is doesn't actually lead us to both calling out what we're facing and also finding solutions for what we're facing. And so I think that's it's critical. And I'm proud to be the one candidate that uses that word. And I use it as a way of expressing what people are seeing happen in their communities and across our country. And why do we talk about it in terms of climate change? Well, I mean, climate change is a human-made phenomenon, and it is very much tied to corporate greed. The kind of sort of production in the name of profit, while disregarding environmental regulations, while disregarding in many cases workers' well-being, while disregarding sort of any sort of collective responsibility we might have. And so I think it's a misnomer to sort of say that, again, climate change is it's a human-made phenomenon, but we can't really point to corporations, or we can't really point to the fact that governments have deregulated or sort of defunded any ability to keep on top of what's been happening, or set very stringent regulations to make sure that corporations, industry isn't abusing the environment. And I mean, no question, other jurisdictions have certainly contributed to climate change. I mean, I would certainly say contemporary China is very much engaged in the capitalist economy in a very extreme sense, and so I mean, again, climate change is or as we know, a lot of the production that takes place there is done without proper regulation. I will say, though, that some of the green investments that are happening in China are being done at a scale that is significant. Now, of course, as is the pollution that's being emitted. But I think, I mean, what's important for me is to recognize that we have to call out the reasons why we've come to this place, and we have to look at what we're doing in our own country. I mean, it's clear to me, we have Justin Trudeau, who talks a great talk on the environment, but sort of in a statement that didn't get much attention, lifted the cap on methane emissions. And, he's somebody who's kept the same targets as Stephen Harper, and yet if you hear the way he talks, you wouldn't know that was the case. And I would say, he's also somebody that's approving pipelines like Kinder Morgan that will contribute to greater carbon emissions. And so I think it's important to be very clear about calling out corporate greed, calling out that neoliberal approach, but also very much saying we need solutions that are rooted in the grassroots. We need solutions that are rooted in citizen power and community power, and like I said, public ownership. Ultimately, we need to challenge the status quo if we're going to take on climate change.
You mentioned pipelines, and that's a big issue here in BC, of course. We have a new NDP government, as you know, that is on the record opposed to Kinder Morgan, is going to do with the Greens everything they can to stop it. But next door we have Rachel Notley and another NDP government that, with their own sort of resource economy, needs to try to find ways to get the resources they have to market so they can keep their province sort of chugging along. It's a very resource-driven province. So how do you sort of balance these dichotomies of, even within the NDP, and try to appeal nationally with that strategy?
Yeah, I mean, I'd start off by saying that that I've done a fair bit of work. I mean, obviously we're doing the interview here in Vancouver, but I want to start off by saying that I've done a fair bit of work in Alberta over the years. You know, I'm from the prairies. I've personal connections to Alberta, and I also come from a resource part of the country, not unlike parts of BC. So I understand how important it is to have very respectful discussions about the need to maintain good jobs in our communities. But I also know what it means to come from a boom and bust economy, and how difficult that is, and how many people that live in that kind of economy don't want that for their kids, don't want that for their future, and so I do, I do believe that we need to put forward a strong principled position when we're talking about development in the era of climate change. That respects Indigenous rights, including the need to have consent of Indigenous peoples when we're talking about development on their territories, but also centering the need for good jobs as we talk about this transition. And I will say that the Alberta government has been investing significantly in that kind of transition, and it would actually move faster if the federal government was actually a partner at the table, which they're not. On Kinder Morgan, I've made it very clear that we need a very strong principled position, and I very much respect what many activists, Indigenous leaders, and of course now the BC government is saying, that this project can't go forward because it is not in line with Indigenous rights. Most of the First Nations oppose it. Also, it is. It contravenes our climate change commitments. If this were to go forward, we wouldn't be able to achieve the targets that we've set out for ourselves. And I also believe it's important to talk about social license. Like, it's not the 1950s anymore, where government and corporations can just run roughshod over the rights of Indigenous peoples, over our environmental rights, and frankly over communities. And so, while that may lead to some disagreements with provincial counterparts, I think there is common ground to be found in terms of, supporting the transition work that's happening, supporting the creation of good jobs, and ultimately saying, this is how we're going to tackle climate change.
There's the argument that making tuition free has a sort of disparate effect of helping the privileged who are already able to access university. The argument is people who are wealthy do better in school because their parents aren't worried about feeding the kids, so the kids also have tutors. What's your justification for giving them free tuition versus a more sort of targeted, like, student grants program?
Mm-hmm. So I would say, first of all, our commitment on free tuition, which is also unique, we're the only campaign that's done so, comes from a place, first of all, recognizing that education is a right. And second of all, is very much rooted in an NDP sort of core value of universality. And I believe that in the times that we live in, where 70% of jobs require a post-secondary education, we should not be indebting a generation for simply doing what we've asked of them. I look at the 17 plus countries around the world that have free tuition, and many of them nowhere near as wealthy as Canada. And that does create a dynamic of accessibility. I know people that have gone to school in countries with free tuition. In fact, my brother just finished a degree in Denmark, a second degree in his master's there. Did his undergrad here in Canada, and on a personal level, I know what that looks like, right, through him. It's liberating compared to what I see so many of my peers, what we've all gone through here. And I think we really, what's important is to recognize the extent to which the millennial generation in Canada is being held back And I would say even kids that grew up in solid sort of quote unquote middle class homes, because of the way in which the job market has worsened for young people, because of the skyrocketing tuitions, because of the fact that housing and renting is so much more expensive. That burden of getting an education has become so significant, and is holding people back. It's holding people back in their careers. It's holding them back. We hear a lot about the rise of stress in terms of mental health, and it's holding people back from reaching those kind of milestones, as we call them, that are important in moving society forward. People are putting off having kids. People are putting off making sort of key investments because they're indebted or they're in school and they can't afford it. So I do think it's very much a case of looking at what are the solutions going forward to tackle inequality, and particularly the kind of intergenerational inequality, but also just making it clear that education is a right.
On the topic of universality, one of the sort of disagreements within this leadership race has been Guy Caron's universal income or basic income kind of proposal. And obviously there's specific models that are better or worse from a sort of leftist perspective, I guess. What's your take on his proposal as it's sort of being developed and as it's a method to try to solve issues of automation and precarious work? What are your alternatives, if not basic income, to sort of tackle those challenges?
Yeah. So I would say, the conversation around basic annual income is an important one, absolutely, and it often is tied into the discussion around precarious work and automation, which are very serious phenomena that we need to be grappling with. But I will say there are some key red flags. It's pretty evident that a lot of the people that cheer on universal basic income are actually on the right of the spectrum, also somebody that was a big fan of it was Milton Friedman. These are folks that yes, may believe in basic annual income, but also believe in cutting the social safety net at the same time. In Ontario, for example, the Liberal Premier Kathleen Wynne has put forward a pilot project on basic annual income, while at the same time cutting healthcare, housing, and privatizing their public hydro. That is not an anti-poverty strategy. The other piece is that it may be a stopgap measure, but it certainly doesn't get at tackling the trends that are leading to greater precarious work, like privatization, like deregulation, like outsourcing, and I believe that is what we need to tackle if we're going to really get at the phenomena of both precarious work and to a certain extent automation, although that is a bit different. And so our campaign has made it very clear that the priority right now needs to be expanding the social safety net. Through our work on precarious work, I've never heard from so many young people about the need for pharmacare and dental care. And they're not calling for it for their parents. They're calling for it for themselves, because increasingly the jobs that we do don't have these kinds of benefits, right? I've never heard from so many young people calling for free tuition. We're hearing about the need for some fundamental changes to our social safety net. And I do disagree with the concept that basic annual income will solve all of these things. I think it's an important discussion. I certainly think we need to be looking at strengthening, income assistance levels, obviously provincial jurisdiction as well, employment insurance, which is inaccessible to most Canadians in this day and age. But like I said, our campaign has said that where we are right now, what's key is expanding the social safety net and clearly, engaging in tax reform so that we can pay for what we need.
Before we move into maybe some closing questions, are there any more detailed policy things you want to talk about that we didn't get through?
Well, one of the policies that I am really proud of, and we are the only campaign that's talked about it, is gender justice. And for me, it's really important that when we talk about inequality, we also talk about inequality based on gender, whether it's the experience of women, trans folks, non-binary folks. And we've been recognized as the only campaign that's had a platform explicitly centered on LGBTQ rights. And what we've said is we may have a prime minister that identifies as feminist, but the resources simply aren't there, and the feminist agenda isn't there either. That we need resources in terms of data collection, we need resources in terms of to reinvest in advocacy and research and service provision. Much of that was cut under Harper, and continues to be non-existent under Justin Trudeau. We also need to ensure that the inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous women is one that's family-led, given the kind of challenges we're facing right now. We've talked about the need for training for law enforcement and people in the justice system. I've worked with survivors of sexual violence who've talked about the fact that our laws are good, but their implementation and their enforcement is sorely lacking. And, we have a lot of people in law enforcement and the justice system that still fall back on rape myths, that still fall back on stereotypes and misogynist stereotypes. And I believe the federal government has a role to play to be a leader when it comes to achieving gender justice. But again, it takes a feminist vision and it takes resources behind that, and I'm proud that our agenda has both.
You mentioned in your platform putting out about $500 million for that versus the $50 million that's out right now.
Yes.
One of the criticisms, because it's really hard to sometimes measure these changes in systemic issues, how do you sort of deflect the possibility that people will criticize it's just sort of shoveling money at lefty causes? Like, how do we make sure that it's used well and solves these problems?
Yeah, well, I mean, I would say that achieving gender justice and tackling violence against women and trans folks and non-binary folks is not actually a lefty cause. It's pretty fundamental to our society moving forward. I mean, one of the things that's been acknowledged is we actually have very little research on the rates of violence. So I'm not talking about discrimination, but violence, and we do need to fund data collection on that front so we know where we're at. From the little that we do know on sexual violence, for example, a report just came out a few weeks ago. Violent crime in Canada has dropped. Sexual violence has remained stagnant and the same, and as has reporting. So, I mean, that's a problem in and of itself, and I think needs to spur governments, and particularly the federal government, into action. It's also clear to me we've lost significant ground in the Harper era, ground that Justin Trudeau has not recaptured. We lost advocacy organizations and research and service provision, and we need to ensure that kind of work continues to be done so that we can truly tackle the violence that gender-based violence that's taking place, in our homes, on our streets, and in our workplaces every single day.
So to put it simply, you're going to commit sociology.
Yes, I used to teach sociology, so I have no problem in doing that. But I will say that I mean, and we pointed it out in our platform. Obviously, gender-based violence has an extreme personal cost, in many cases death, but it also has an economic cost to the tune of $12 billion a year. And so when we're talking about smart economic policy, tackling gender-based violence would be a way of coming up with that kind of policy.
How would an Ashton-led NDP defeat Trudeau in 2019? Or is that even the goal? Is it more important to be true to the values and focus on the movement rather than pure pragmatic electability?
Well, I do believe winning is important. I mean, I have won a few elections, so I certainly see the absolute value of that. And defeating Trudeau, yes, is important in 2019. But I believe that what needs to drive us is not. I mean, as much as we oppose the Trudeau agenda, what we need to do is propose an agenda that is reflective of where Canadians are at, where the challenges that we're facing, growing inequality and climate change, and I believe a truly progressive agenda, that's put out there clearly and proudly, working with social movements, working with activists, working with labor, working with community leaders, leaders across our country to bring that agenda forward would be a big way in which we could get at the Trudeau machine, I would say. I mean, I've said this time and time again, Canada in 2019 will be different for many reasons, not just because of the challenges we face, but also our demographics. In 2019, the largest voting bloc will be the millennial generation. 37% of Canadian voters will be millennials. And we know that millennials tend to be more progressive, and many of them are clearly rejecting the status quo, calling for more progressive policies, see that government has a key role to play, and take both the issues of inequality and climate change very seriously. And so I do believe that, again, with that kind of strong NDP vision, progressive vision, we could certainly make waves, and I hope defeat Trudeau in 2019.
All right, just a final question. What's one thing you actually like or respect about Justin Trudeau and the Liberals and Andrew Scheer and the Conservatives? And sort of related to that, who would be your second choice in the NDP leadership race? Or what's one thing you like about the other candidates in there, if you don't want to give me that?
So, I certainly... I would say that in terms of anybody that sets to do the work of a prime minister, I respect the kind of commitment that goes into it. I do obviously disagree vehemently with sort of the values that many folks in other parties share. I will say that in the case of Andrew Scheer, I'm deeply troubled by what he stands for. He's somebody I've worked with in the House of Commons. He's voted against a woman's right to choose, against same-sex marriage, against trans rights. He said discriminatory things about Muslim communities, and and I have no time for that kind of politics. For me, that's the Trump-like politics that are toxic. South of the border and where we are as well. In terms of our race, I'm very excited to be in a race with people I respect greatly. Obviously, two of the other candidates, Charlie Angus, Guy Caron, I've worked with for a number of years around the table, and we took on Harper and now we're taking on Trudeau. But I think it's an exciting race. Everybody is contributing something very, making serious, significant contribution, bringing people into the party, which is really exciting, and committed to rebuilding the party, and that's something that I think all of us. We have to do that. The NDP from here on has to be a stronger force, and a force that's far more tuned in with the grassroots, and certainly as our campaign sees it, much more principled and just proud to be a progressive party.
And where can people find out more if they want to get involved?
That is a great question. So we're certainly, if people, if your listeners are excited about some of the things that we've talked about, excited about some of the key policy platforms, and as I've noted on a number of them, our work is being acknowledged as one of a kind. We're certainly encouraging folks to get in touch with us. They can connect with us through our website, nikiashton2017.ca. Obviously, the number one way people could show support for our agenda is by signing up to become members of the NDP, which can also be done online. That has to be done before August 17th, and that means that whoever signs up to be a member will have a chance to vote in the leadership. And what's exciting about this race is the voting is relatively accessible, either by mail or online. People don't need to show up to a meeting or convention. It can be done from the comfort of their own home or wherever on their phone. So it is a very dynamic opportunity, and all that information is also available on our website, and we look forward to keeping in touch.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
All right, well, since you didn't get a chance to be there, I did manage to get a few of your questions in, and hopefully you felt I read them reasonably as they were intended. But what did you sort of take away from that interview?
Well, I probably would have, if I was there, pushed a little harder on a couple of the questions, like the connection between quote-unquote neoliberalism and climate change. And the thrust of what I was trying to get at when I wrote the question down was that this is one of those areas where, well, there's definitely a profit motive at play. It's a much too simple of an idea, I think, to really just pin it all on that. And, we've seen plenty of non-market economies to make really environmentally destructive decisions. So maybe it's a much more of a multifaceted problem than campaign rhetoric would suggest.
What I was kind of hoping for in that answer was to point to the sort of social democratic countries of Europe that have taken significant action and say, it's not a false dichotomy. There are ways to approach it, and we clearly need more government intervention to do it. Obviously, we both have different views, mine being closer to Niki, so I'm fairly sympathetic to what she had to say. And we also had a tight amount of time with pages of questions. We could have spent all day just getting into wonky stuff, but she had her sort of, like any candidate for a race will have the talking points she wants to get through.
Yeah, there's nearly a full hour of it up on Patreon. So plenty was asked, and we still didn't even get through the whole list. So, and, it was a dodge, but, it's also the sort of thing that you're kind of expecting during a campaign from a politician. And yeah, same sort of thing. And the question about ensuring money was well spent on, made a good case that why it's an important policy to go for, but didn't really touch on the how do you actually be effective with your resources.
On the gender discrimination
yes.
and violence kind of programs that you talked about.
But yeah, the other thing then, this has come up in a few of the debates, is around the universal basic income promise. Specifically the criticism that she leveled both in this interview and during the debates too, about kind of the wrong sort of people liking it, such as citing Milton Friedman's support of negative income tax as one of the models of the universal basic income. And it's one of those things that just strikes me as a little, I guess, partisan in a way, or too much of having a ideological axe to grind, or too much of a team mentality on it. Because this is the sort of thing that, hey, people from all sides of the political spectrum kind of like this idea, should be the sort of thing we celebrate, because it's pretty rare these days. And taking the opposite approach of, those guys like it, must not be good, was not something I found particularly inspiring, or the sort of thing I'd be looking for in a leader.
I did like that she emphasized the importance of the conversations more broadly, and I also appreciated that she tried to focus on sort of the systemic issues that she wanted to tackle. Obviously, basic income's trying to replace systemic issues, but sort of going after discrimination or going after low wages from the, I guess, socialist angle of it's the employer's fault. Let's not just subsidize employers with basic income is an approach. We can't take ideas from the right because they have bad ideas. Of course, that's something that frustrates me. I like the idea of good ideas can come from anywhere, but the basic income conversation also gets complicated because there are different models, some that are driven by a more, let's just get rid of the social safety net and have a universal program that will magically erase a lot of other issues. Is optimistic, but then there are other models that would potentially be more at home in the NDP, like probably what Guy Caron is talking about. And hopefully when we get him, fingers crossed, we can drill him on his specifics on that.
Yeah, the only other part of that kind of struck me as overly partisan was the question about, what do you respect in the other leaders or the other parties? And it's one of those things that it's the sort of question that everyone should be able to come up with at least something nice to say about the other person, even if it's just, I appreciate their work ethic, or, their
kids, like Hillary Clinton said about Donald Trump.
It's the sort of thing that not being able to come up with anything good, or even one little thing you respect about someone else, it's maybe a sign there's a little too much partisanship in the air on some of these sorts of things.
I was also thinking about that too since that interview, because I know she's running a very specific kind of campaign and targeting a very sort of specific approach, which is also in the midst of a leadership race rather than a general election. In a general election, you're trying to broaden your appeal, not necessarily have conservative voters who really like Scheer come over to the NDP, but have this very soft ones or have liberals come over. To win the leadership, she needs to create a very specific sort of campaign. And I know one thing that was criticized against Jeremy Corbyn for a long time was this sort of, oh, he's kind of this cranky old, too partisan, like can't even get along with people in Labour. And then he did manage to he didn't win the general election, but did far better. And that's not to say she can do what Jeremy Corbyn is, but it's what she is trying to do. So I think the strategy there isn't necessarily going to fail her, even if you wish it would.
It may not be a bad strategic move, but on a, what does this kind of reflect? It's maybe not the greatest.
Well, and the one bit of news that's come out since that interview is that Niki Ashton announced actually just today that she's raised over $100,000 in July alone. This is sort of a leak before the full fundraising data from all the campaigns come out, I think next week, but that wouldn't include this last month or two. But this is on par with what Charlie Angus, who is seen as one of the top fundraisers so far, raised in the first quarter. And obviously all of their fundraising will be picking up. But I think she's not in the sort of 7th place of 7 that she was in the previous leadership campaign. And we had this Main Street poll put her just slightly behind Charlie Angus recently. So she's on track to pick up something. It's hard to say if she'll still win or if some of this will still alienate some people. But it is sort of an interesting race to just watch from inside or out, I guess.
Yeah, and I think that in part kind of reflects where the political ground has shifted since 2011. Because, the NDP's very much pivoted away from we want to take power and kind of move to the build on our official opposition status to viably contest the next election, to much more of a, we want to be the voice of the movement sort of campaign on the principles, not the power.
I'm not sure any of them are going to say, well, obviously none of them are going to say they're not trying to win, but I think there is also a view that selling out didn't work, but using some of the momentum of the Bernie or Jeremy Corbyn style could prove more effective in the climate as it is, with a sort of Justin Trudeau breaking his promises, Conservatives going far right kind of narrative, and then saying, look, we're going to offer you a genuine left alternative. Because even Charlie Angus and Jagmeet Singh, who are being painted as the sort of moderates, are still running to the left of where Thomas Mulcair was by far.
Yeah, I think part of what happened in the last election wasn't so much the NDP didn't move far enough left, it's that they just ran a bad campaign.
Well, there's something disingenuous about the NDP saying our biggest priority is balancing the budget. Like, you expect them to say it, but not keep hammering on it. Like, sell us some ideas.
There's no way the NDP couldn't have announced an intention to run a balanced budget, because otherwise they'd be playing into every kind of negative image of them. But they definitely overemphasized it, and the angry Tom that everybody loved from Question Period mysteriously disappeared. And, if Tom hadn't been given a bunch of sedatives before going out on the debate stage, there might be a decent chance that he'd be Prime Minister right now.
But we'll come back to this and far more as we hopefully line up interviews with the other campaigns. If you're involved in any of those campaigns, reach out to us. We'll give you as much time as your candidate wants to give. If they want to talk for 3 hours, we can probably find enough to ask and talk about. But, 30, 40 minutes would be amazing. And we're also hoping to have, in the next few weeks, we're not exactly sure when yet, a deep dive into the NDP leadership race in a similar way as we did with the Conservative race. But this time we can actually look at all of the candidates because we can count them on one hand. Yeah,
that was a part of the reason we didn't try and reach out to the Conservatives during their leadership races. Well, with 14 of them, we couldn't only just ask a few. It wouldn't really be fair to ask a few of them.
We would have felt like physically sick if we had to sit down with Kelly Leitch for an hour.
Yeah, that one would have been one I would have looked forward to, that's for sure. Moving on to quick takes, there's a few news stories out of the Vancouver area on the housing front. The city of Vancouver made some announcements. It's almost like there's a by-election coming up or something about affordable housing, specifically a pilot project around the Canby corridor, where they're in effect going to be trying out a new inclusionary zoning system that requires new rental developments to set aside 20% for affordable housing, defined as 30% of household income. And basically in exchange for these requirements, the developers would get either density bonuses or allowed to relax on some of their parking requirements, or some of their fees will get waived by the city.
I imagine you'd be really happy with all three of those allowances just being included automatically, but I think those are good things to add in there. The focus on making sure there's some affordable rental apartments in there, I like to see. This roughly translates to meaning you'd pay $850 to $1,000 a month for a studio, up to maybe $2,000 roughly for a 2-bedroom. How much this helps people on low incomes and fixed incomes, it doesn't really, but I guess they're targeted with other projects, and this is maybe that missing middle.
Yeah, this is what's being branded as the right kind of supply for Vancouver. A phrase which I find somewhat odd, considering that we save 70% of the city for $1 million homes, but that's a whole other thing. Yeah, this is kind of targeting that kind of mid to lower mid-market affordable range. And I do think it's good they are giving some trade-offs to the developers on there, because one of the problems with these inclusionary zoning systems is if you just mandate it, well then every other unit that goes for a market rate gets a lot more expensive, because all of a sudden your revenues reduce when 20% of the units are going below market. So having something here, and I haven't actually run the numbers or seen a good analysis on this, on if that actually breaks even or on it. So it might be a case where you get some of the more marginal housing projects not actually going forward, and that could hurt the overall supply, both below market rate and market rate housing.
I also just like the idea of running a pilot project at this point. Like, they're good in principle, but we are, as you, I think, mentioned last week, in the midst of a housing crisis, and we should experiment in public policy, but sometimes you might almost just need to go radical and just be like, let's just do this. Like, let's just make this.
Yeah, the time for pilot projects was 5 to 10 years ago. Right now, where it's kind of the point where you need something a little more significant than one section of the city that's kind of the one area of the city that's already getting upzoned, and just adding a few more affordable units in there. And I mentioned this earlier, but they keep talking about the right kind of supply, but most of the city is still reserved for completely unaffordable housing options for everyone. It's a very wealthy people who afford to put down like $2 million for a house. So it's the sort of thing where this is too little too late.
This is basically predicted, to put it into real numbers, as more than 4,000 new affordable home projects by 2041, which is quite a ways away.
Yeah, and
we're going to need more than 4,000 houses by then.
Yeah, and that's one of the criticisms of inclusionary zoning, is that it's hard to scale effectively, especially in very high-cost cities like Vancouver or San Francisco. And just for comparison, this past year there's 30,000 housing starts in Metro Vancouver. So 11,000 over a couple decades is pretty much a drop in the bucket to new housing. And the stuff that would in theory be relatively affordable rental housing was stuff that was built 15 to 25 years ago, which just really wasn't built. Not much new rental housing got built back then. So this is at best a stopgap.
On the other side of boundary, Burnaby is looking at a much sort of bigger and wide sweeping plan, as they've just approved their new Metro Town sort of downtown Burnaby plan. And so Burnaby's been a bit smarter than Vancouver in recent years about densifying around transit hubs and allowing lots of towers. Burnaby just has more towers going up than Vancouver, and they're all at transit hub, which makes sense. they're now deciding, or they've been working towards this plan of Metrotown becoming a sort of downtown, but in Burnaby rather than in Vancouver. And there's already a ton of towers around there, and it's building up pretty quick. So this plan calls for a sort of mass rezoning and converts a lot of 2-3-story, even some of those 4-story apartment buildings that are right now mostly low-income renters, and converting those into condo towers. And I think when I was looking at condos in the Burnaby area, they were mostly starting at 600,000, probably, or up for the sort of 1 to 2 bedroom. So it's not a cheap area, and if they built all these towers right away and flooded the market, they could maybe bring the price down. But this plan has sort of upset a lot of the anti-displacement advocates who look at this as a way to just like over-gentrify, kick out the low-income people who are in reasonably good places for their situation and replace it with wealthy condos. Meanwhile, there's actually quite a few single-family homes in the broader sort of area there that aren't quite as, I don't want to say offensive to density as Vancouver's neighborhoods, but are still fairly substantial and are still sort of being allowed to stay very low density.
Yeah, there's no doubt that the metro area in general needs a whole bunch of increased density, but the Burnaby approach is just the wrong way to do it, where you're taking the few already dense places and just adding a whole bunch more density there while leaving everything else untouched. Especially when, that's one of the few areas that there's somewhat affordable housing options still there. And, there's areas that are within walking distance of a SkyTrain station. I work in Burnaby and sometimes take the SkyTrain there, and between the station I get off at and my work, I pass through a single-family neighborhood, and there's a bunch of them there throughout Burnaby around a whole bunch of SkyTrain stations that just don't have any density really right now and could easily be densified rather than cramming it all into the areas that already have the density. And Vancouver hasn't thrown up nearly as many towers, but it's kind of doing many of the same things where part of the reason the Kiefer project was so controversial is it's kind of stuffing the densification and the new condo developments in the few low-income rental areas that already exist.
Well, moving east in Alberta this past week, the Wild Rose and Progressive Conservatives held their merger votes, and to sort of the surprise of everyone, it seemed, actually voted not just for it. That was sort of the safe bet, but both parties voted over 95% in favor of it. And I feel like the only times you get votes that strong are either when you're in a very small nonprofit where no one cares, or you're in a dictatorship where if you don't vote that way, you don't get to vote again. I'm not saying this happened in either of those cases, but it was kind of a shock that for all the rumblings and rumors that there were going to be a bunch of grumpy Wild Rosers who were just too free-minded and right-wing to ever consider a merger with the PCs, that when push came to shove, 95% of them were on side. There were a number of stories about ballot issues that came up, sort of like the Conservative federal leadership race. I guess Conservatives are having a little tough time these days voting for whatever reason, but none of that seems to suggest it was not untoward. My sort of suspicion, which I have not a ton to base it on, is just that Jason Kenney was able to organize so many people who took over the PCs, but then also came over into the Wild Rose, that probably a lot of them just voted twice because the PCs allowed that, and I don't think anyone in the Wild Rose at this point was really stopping it, so the same people just voted in both cases. And a lot of people on the right in Alberta are really unhappy with the NDP because it's Alberta, and so they're moving forward with the merger. So UCP is the new party of Alberta. This has already led to some controversy. MLA from the Progressive Conservative Caucus, Richard Stark, who I think actually briefly ran for the leadership against Jason Kenney, announced he's not joining the UCP caucus. He thinks they're too right-wing extremist. And I guess he's going to sit as an independent now. He might be able to still call himself a progressive conservative. I don't know how it exactly works, but he's not going to be UCP. He probably won't win re-election at this point because it seems like most of the province is against him, unless he's popular in his riding, in which case Alberta can have another sort of independent / small party because they also have the Alberta Party guy and the Liberal Party guy. Going forward, the UCP appointed a interim leader while they have their leadership race. MLA, I don't think anyone outside of the very small Alberta political circles had ever heard of, called Nathan Cooper. But a couple groups went looking into his record, and I guess he's affiliated with some pro-life, family rights type groups, Christian evangelical type groups in the past. And in the past, he spoke out against gay marriage and those kind of things, which he's come around to now. He's, not against LGBT rights anymore. He thinks gay student alliances, which have been a hot topic in Alberta, should be allowed to exist. Although in some cases, parents should be told if their kids are joining them because, come on, we need to know what your kids are doing and parents' rights and whatnot. But the real sort of scoop was that someone asked him if today he still thinks abortion should be illegal. And he's like, I don't know. He said in the past he would work towards banning abortion, or at least banning the provincial government from paying for it, because he compared it to like a toothache. And if you have a toothache, you just deal with that yourself. Why should the government pay for it? But in my mind, this kind of justifies having dental care. Like, if we pay for abortions, we should pay for toothaches too, obviously. So he's a treat, but he'll be gone in a couple months, or at least back to the backbenches. Meanwhile, we have Brian Jean, Jason Kenney, probably Doug Schweitzer and Derek Wildebrandt, all potentially launching leadership bids. At least Brian Jean and Jason Kenney already have. Jean's oddly kind of trying to run, instead of from the Wild Rose right, into a more moderate role. But then he announced one of his first pitches would be to cut $2.6 billion from the Alberta budget, the budget of which is only $40 billion right now. So axing almost 10% of your budget is one thing to do. Derek Wildebrandt's been talking about the same kind of level of cuts, and we were looking at some of his promises earlier that he's just talked to random people about, and he's like, if you pay lower income tax anywhere and can prove it, you should get a refund from the Alberta government, a sort of like lowest tax guarantee that you would expect from a grocery store. I haven't seen anything that Jason Kenney's promised to do, and I don't know what Doug Schweitzer, the lawyer that Stephen Carter in a couple episodes past talked about, what they're looking at doing right now. But Alberta's a fun place for a little while, and maybe the strategist should come back on the air. Or if you want to hear Stephen Carter give our show an explicit tag again, let us know, and we'll bring him back to give a much deeper dive into this.
And finally tonight,
Trump was having a weird sort of debate within the military about whether or not to fund gender reassignment surgeries for trans people.
Not just fund them, like whether or not trans people were even able to serve.
Well, that was the initial debate, was about the healthcare funding. And then he decided, instead of having this debate in a meeting room with generals and policy experts and all of this, he would just go to Twitter and announce that trans people can no longer be in the military. Because that's how democracy works now.
Despite Trump's insisting that he, thought this over and everyone in the military agreed with him, the actual military was caught off guard by it. And I believe the chief of the army today came out and basically said, yeah, I found out about it from the news like everyone else did. And, the Secretary of Defense is on vacation. So this is really one of those just random Trump thoughts that gets put out into Twitter and almost becomes policy. But the Pentagon said, until we actually get a legit order and not a series of tweets, nothing's changing as far as we're concerned.
The thing I appreciated a lot more was the Canadian forces going out of their way to advertise as soon as they saw that. Yeah, we're an open and accepting military force, but you have this situation where militaries are basically trolling each other on the internet.
Yeah, I think this might actually be the CF's most viral tweet of all time.
And as it stands, nothing has actually changed within the US military, because it will take an actual executive order coming through before this becomes policy. But Trump can whip those up in minutes, and apparently doesn't run them by lawyers anyway. So could happen any day, or it could never happen, which makes life for the 1,000 to 10,000 trans people in the US military, I've seen different numbers quoted, very uncertain and very uncomfortable, which is not something you really want to do to the people who you're asking to put their lives on the line.
And that has been Politos. Find links to the stories you mentioned in the show notes at politos.ca. Make sure to subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts, and follow us on Facebook and Twitter at PolitosPod. Leave us a review and let us know what you think. Support the show and get early access to our interviews at patreon.com/Polititoast. And if you have ideas for the show, feel free to send them to us. Thanks for listening.